The wind was sharp that evening on Lexington Avenue. Dry leaves skittered across the sidewalk, scratching against the pavement like restless memories. Inside a tucked-away corner cafe called Haven House, warm light spilled through fogged windows, catching the edges of a sign that had seen better years. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where time moved slower. Elise Warren, 39, stood still for a moment before entering. Her coat was older than it looked. The color faded at the seams. The shoes on her feet had lost their shape, and her gloves didn't match. But she had promised Mara, her oldest friend, that she would show up even if it felt ridiculous. Inside, the cafe hummed with soft chatter and the clinking of ceramic cups. A jazz instrumental played low from unseen speakers. Elise paused just beyond the threshold, pulling out her phone to check the message again. "He's at table 9 by the window. Brown coat. Be kind, he's nervous too." She counted the tables as she moved 4, 6, 8, 9. There he was, sitting alone, facing the window. Brown wool coat, salt and pepper hair cropped neatly above the collar. One hand held a cup of tea, the other idly turning a spoon. Elise approached carefully. "Excuse me," she said, voice more breath than sound. "Are you Nathan?" The man looked up. For a moment, his brow lifted, not quite surprise, not quite recognition. Then he smiled. It was a small, deliberate smile, like someone remembering a name just in time. "I am," he said. "You must be Elise. Please, sit." She hesitated, but sat. The chair felt colder than she expected. She set her gloves on the table, then folded her hands in her lap. She noticed his eyes were clear and kind, but not intrusive. Conversation came in fragments, at first polite, unremarkable. Elise talked about her part-time work at the public library, the sketchbooks she kept tucked beneath her bed. He mentioned something about consulting in digital systems, which could mean anything, but he didn't linger on it, and she didn't ask. What struck her most was the silence between sentences. It wasn't awkward, it felt allowed, as though neither of them were trying to impress or fill space. At one point, he asked what kind of art she liked to draw. "People," she answered, "when they think no one's looking." He nodded thoughtfully, as if that made perfect sense. Nearly an hour passed. The light outside dimmed to a deep gray, the kind that made streetlights flicker to life. Elise realized her tea had gone cold. Just then, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. "Hey, Elise, I'm at table 4, been here 10 minutes. Where are you? Nathan." The words blurred. Her breath caught. She looked up at the man across from her, her cheeks flushed. You're not Nathan." The man's smile softened, almost apologetic. "No, I'm not." A hollow silence followed. Elise stood abruptly. "I'm so sorry. I sat at the wrong table. This is terribly embarrassing." "Please don't worry," he said gently, but she was already reaching for her coat. Outside, the wind had picked up. Elise walked quickly, head down, heart thudding not from embarrassment alone, but from something else she couldn't quite name. Inside, the man at table 9 sat for a while longer, his tea now just steam rising into the soft air. His name was Miles Carter, and though he hadn't planned to speak to anyone that night, he found himself replaying the curve of Elise's smile and the quiet way she listened. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Elise's apartment sat above a shuttered bookstore on a quiet side street. The building had no elevator, only narrow stairs that creaked with memory. She liked it that way. There was comfort in old things, in places that didn't pretend to be more than they were. That night, she sat cross-legged on her worn couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a half-finished sketch resting in her lap. She wasn't drawing. Her pencil hung limp between her fingers. Across the room, Mara leaned against the kitchen doorway, sipping wine from a mismatched mug. "So," Mara said slowly, "did you meet him?" Elise sighed. "I met someone." Mara raised an eyebrow. "That's vague." "I sat at the wrong table. Talked to a complete stranger for an hour. Thought he was Nathan. He didn't correct me." Mara lowered the mug. "He just went along with it?" Elise nodded. "What did he do? Laugh it off?" "No," Elise said. He listened. They were both quiet for a moment. Was he awful? Mara finally asked. No, Elise admitted. He was calm. Not the kind of man who needs to talk to fill a room. Mara watched her friend carefully. You ran, didn't you? I had to, Elise said too quickly. I felt stupid. I sat there like some fool, assuming he was someone else, telling him about my sketchbooks and library job like it mattered. But it did matter, Mara said. To him, it probably mattered more than you think. Elise looked down at the drawing in her lap. It was an unfinished portrait, a woman on a park bench, her hands folded in thought. She didn't know why she'd left that conversation feeling more seen than she had in years. Miles Carter's evening. Across town, in a high-rise loft where the furniture was expensive but lived in, Miles Carter sat at his kitchen counter, turning a tea mug in his hand. The apartment was quiet. No music, no television. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of Elise's laughter in his memory. He didn't usually talk to strangers. He rarely allowed new people into his world. In tech consulting, everything was efficient, structured, optimized, often sterile. Conversations were strategic. Emotions were filtered through contracts and PowerPoint decks. But this woman Elise had leaned forward when she spoke, eyes steady, as though she wasn't trying to sell anything. Her life was smaller, perhaps, but not lesser. It had weight. She had looked at him like he was ordinary. And for once, that felt like a gift. A message left unsent. Elise opened her phone that night, thumb hovering over a blank text message. She had no number for him, no name, even only the table, the moment, the warmth. She closed the screen. Some meetings, she told herself, are meant to be one-offs, accidents that fade like smoke. But deep down, a part of her disagreed. A week passed. The city shifted from cold to colder. Storefronts began dressing their windows for December, and the sidewalks wore a dusting of frost by morning. Elise kept herself busy shifts at the library, sketching in the quiet hours, coffee with Mara. Still, the memory of the man at table 9 surfaced at odd times. When she opened the cafe door again, when she heard someone order chamomile tea, or when a stranger on the train wore a coat just like his. She hadn't expected to think of him again, and yet there he was, uninvited, lingering. Then one afternoon, as she was shelving a cart of returns in the art section, the front desk called her name. Elise, someone left this for you. She walked over, confused. A plain manila envelope, unsealed. No name, no note, just her first name printed in neat handwriting on the front. Inside, she found a sketch. Black ink on cream paper. A woman seated at a cafe table, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug, a half smile touching her lips, her head tilted slightly uncertain, thoughtful. It was her. She recognized the scarf she wore that night. The lines captured something she hadn't known anyone else had seen, the quiet edge of vulnerability behind her small talk. At the bottom corner, a simple signature, M. Carter. Her heart paused. The man at table 9 had been watching her, even as he listened, and he had remembered. Across the river, Miles hadn't intended to draw her. The sketch had come late one night, unplanned. A few strokes, then a few more. Before he realized it, her face had emerged from the page with startling clarity. Not perfect, more impression than portrait, but there was no mistaking the expression. He wasn't sure what compelled him to leave it at the library. Maybe he hoped she'd throw it away. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd understand. He didn't leave his number. That felt too forward. He left the art, and with it, a door she could open if she wanted. The decision. Elise sat with the sketch long after she should have been home. She turned it over, looked at the lines, traced the shape of her own hands. People don't draw strangers unless they care. Not like this. Finally, she folded the page carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and stood up. She walked to the front desk, cheeks flushed. "Did you see who left this?" The librarian nodded. Tall man, gray coat, said he'd stop by again Friday afternoon. Elise blinked. 2 days. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but she knew she would be there. Friday came wrapped in a thin veil of snow, the kind that didn't stick, but danced in the air like it had something to say. Elise arrived at the library earlier than usual, pretending she had reshelving to do. In truth, her hands were too restless for tasks. The envelope was tucked into her coat pocket, creased softly at the edges where she had opened and closed it too many times. By 3 o'clock, she had made her third pass through the new arrival shelf. At 3:07, she heard the chime of the front door. He stepped in quietly, not expecting to be seen. Same coat, same slow walk. Miles Carter looked around without urgency, pausing to glance at a display near the desk. Elise stood, smoothing her sweater with nervous hands, then walked toward him. He turned when she was close, eyes lighting not with surprise but with a quiet, cautious recognition. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she replied. A brief smile passed between them, the kind that held more than words could carry. "I got your drawing," Elise said, her voice level but soft. "I hoped you would," he said. "I wasn't sure if it was appropriate." She tilted her head. "What made you do it?" Miles hesitated. "I guess I didn't want the last word between us to be silence." They stood there for a beat, surrounded by shelves and old paper and the small lives of stories. "I didn't know your name," Elise said, "until I saw the signature." He nodded. "Miles Carter." "Elise Warren." Another moment passed. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "if you'd like, maybe we could sit, someplace quieter. Not a mistake this time." She smiled, just a little. "Let's try table 9. They returned to Haven House. Not as strangers, not as a mix-up, just two people who hadn't finished their conversation. The table was open. Snow tapped at the windows. The waitress, older and kind-eyed, brought 2 cups without being asked. They didn't speak much at first, but there was no weight in the silence, only space. Eventually, Miles said, "You made me curious that night. You spoke like someone who's lived inside her thoughts a long time." Elise sipped her tea. "I suppose I have." "That sketch," she said after a while, "it saw me, not the me I show, the one underneath." He met her eyes. "That's the only one I wanted to draw." Outside, people hurried along, hunched into scarves and gloves. But inside table 9, time unfolded slowly. Not everything needed to be solved in one sitting. Sometimes, the quiet between two people was enough to begin again. The following Sunday, Elise invited Miles to her apartment. Not for dinner, not for any occasion. Just an afternoon quiet and unplanned with tea, conversation, and the soft ticking of the wall clock her mother had given her years ago. The apartment was modest. Books stacked beneath the windows, mismatched chairs, and a paint-splattered coffee table that once lived in someone else's attic. Her world was not polished, but it was hers, and she was strangely nervous to let him see it. Miles didn't look out of place. He moved through her space as if he understood its language. When he sat on the window bench, he didn't ask for a cushion or shift uncomfortably. He simply looked out at the street below, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug. "You draw here?" he asked. She nodded, kneeling beside a shallow wooden crate beneath the bench. From it, she lifted several sketchbooks, worn and bending at the corners. "I don't show these to many people." "Then thank you," he said quietly. She handed him one, not the newest, but one she trusted. He opened it gently, turning pages without commentary at first. Each drawing was a moment. A man asleep on the train, a girl chasing pigeons in the square, an elderly woman clutching a bag of oranges. There were no captions, just observation, expression, and empathy in ink. "These feel like memories," Miles said, "but not just yours." She looked at him. He wasn't flattering her. He meant it. "They're all small things," Elise said, "but I think small things matter." Miles closed the sketchbook and set it down. He didn't speak for a while. Then, "When I was younger, I used to think success would feel like a switch flipping. One day I'd wake up and everything would make sense. I'd have the house, the job, the whatever people chased. But most days, I just feel like I'm watching my own life from outside the glass." Elise studied him. Not pity, but understanding. "And now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "But this," he gestured at the space around them, "feels more real than anything I've done in a long time." They didn't touch. There was no rush, but something had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, it settles, like snowfall. That night, after Miles left, Elise stood at the window bench and opened a fresh page in her sketchbook. She didn't try to draw his face. She drew a window with 2 mugs beside it, one nearly full, one half drunk. And outside, a city still moving but softer somehow, as if listening. 2 weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday morning, Elise opened her mailbox and found an envelope that didn't belong to bills or seasonal flyers. The paper was cream-colored, thick, with her name written in dark blue ink, no return address, no logo, just a single initial pressed into the seal. She sat on the bottom step of the building, cold air brushing her ankles, and opened it right there, as if something in her hands couldn't wait. Inside was a letter, not typed, not formal, handwritten. "Elise, I'm not always good at saying things out loud, so I'm writing instead. The night we met, or rather, the night you mistook me for someone else, was supposed to be uneventful. I had gone to Haven House to cancel a meeting that never showed. I had no reason to stay. Then you sat down. You didn't know who I was, and that was a kind of gift. You spoke freely, not to impress, not to network, not to perform, just to be. I hadn't had a conversation like that in years. There was a gentleness in the way you looked at the world, even when you spoke about the hard parts, and you never once asked what I did, or what I owned, or what car I drove. That may sound trivial, but it wasn't. You saw me, and I saw you. I don't know what this is becoming between us. I only know I'd like to keep walking wherever it leads. So here's my part. No expectations, just honesty. If you ever feel the same, meet me at table 9 this Saturday. If not, I'll understand, and I'll be glad for the evening we shared. Miles. Elise folded the letter slowly. Her hands were trembling slightly, but not from the cold. She didn't know what surprised her more, the quiet vulnerability of the words, or how clearly she could hear his voice in them. She sat there a while, letter in her lap, the rest of the world unbothered around her. The city moved on. Dogs barked in the distance. A man passed by, humming off-key. But something inside her had gone very still. She didn't know exactly what she would do, but she knew where she would be on Saturday. Saturday arrived without fanfare. The sky held the color of tin, neither bright nor dark, and the wind smelled faintly of snow yet to come. Elise left her apartment wearing the coat with a deep inner pocket, the one that fit the letter just right. She didn't tell Mara. She didn't rehearse anything. She only knew that something unspoken had been waiting at the edge of her thoughts since the night at Haven House. She walked slowly. Not because she was unsure, but because some things deserved to be approached with care. The cafe was half full. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, soft and matte. A couple near the back laughed quietly over a shared muffin. A man read a newspaper in the corner, dog-eared and faded. Table 9 was empty. Her chest dipped, just for a second. She stood still. Then the barista behind the counter, the same one with the kind eyes, gave her a small wave and pointed toward the window. There he was. Miles stood outside, just a few steps down the sidewalk, looking not anxious, but quietly hopeful. He hadn't gone in yet. He was waiting, perhaps, in case she didn't come. Perhaps to give her the final choice. She stepped out. The street was calm. The breeze tugged gently at her scarf. "You're here," he said. "I am." Neither of them smiled right away. It didn't feel like a smiling moment. It felt like something better, steady, real. "I didn't want to assume," he added. "I thought maybe you'd changed your mind." "I read your letter 4 times, she said. "Once on the stairs, once at the window bench, twice more before I went to bed. If I hadn't come, it would have been fear, not honesty." Miles let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Would you like to walk a while?" he asked. Elise nodded. And they did. Not toward any particular destination. Just two people moving through a gray-blue afternoon, the silence between them comfortable, like a worn coat passed between friends. At one point, she told him about the first time she ever drew someone without them, knowing a man waiting for a bus, humming to himself with his hands in his coat. "You sketch the unnoticed," Miles said. "They usually say the unseen," she replied. "But yes, I think," he said slowly, "you make people visible again." They paused near a narrow park, where the leaves had long since fallen and the benches stood empty. She looked at him, not the tailored coat, not the success. Just him. "I'm not looking for rescue," she said. "Not from anything." "I never thought you were," he replied. "You already built your own raft." She smiled. For the first time that day, she smiled. 8. A room with no pretense. The first time Miles stepped fully into Elise's apartment without any polite formality. It was a Sunday evening, not planned, not orchestrated. Just a moment that followed a shared walk, a cup of cider, and an instinct not to let the evening end yet. She unlocked the door and said, "Come in if you want," with the kind of ease that didn't need clarification. Inside, nothing had changed since his last visit. The same second-hand bookshelf, the same fading rug with a coffee stain near the edge. But this time, he noticed more. The chipped corner of her table, the sketch pinned to the refrigerator with a broken magnet, the paper star taped above her bedroom doorway. A life lived honestly. No design for show. No space meant to impress. Miles took off his coat, folded it carefully, and placed it on the back of a chair. Elise handed him a warm mug and said nothing at first. They moved through the apartment like people who had known each other longer than they had. Later, they sat together on the floor, backs against the sofa, legs stretched out toward the window. Rain tapped lightly at the glass. The city, beyond, blurred. "I'm not always good at this," Miles said. "At what?" "Letting someone in when the lights are still on." Elise didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a box beside the sofa, a shoebox, old and fraying, and opened it in his lap. Inside were drawings, dozens of them, not from sketchbooks. Loose pages, some crumpled, some water-stained, none framed, none perfect. "These are mine," she said. "The ones I don't show anyone." Miles looked down. A child reaching for a balloon. A woman gripping a payphone with tears streaking her face. A man hunched beneath an umbrella that wasn't quite big enough. They were raw, immediate, unpolished. "They're beautiful," he said, barely above a whisper. "No," she replied, "they're honest." He looked at her. In the low light, she looked tired but at peace, like someone who had stopped pretending a long time ago. "I used to think love had to look like control," she said. "Matching schedules, shared calendars, forward motion. And now I think it's just someone you can be quiet with." Miles didn't reach for her hand. He didn't move closer. He simply nodded. And in that moment, the room held something neither of them could name. Not love yet, but the shape of it. As winter edged deeper into the calendar, the world outside Elise's window slowed. The city dimmed earlier each evening, and the hush of cold settled into the spaces between hours. But inside her apartment, things were stirring in a quiet way. Miles had begun leaving things unintentionally at first. A book he was reading, a scarf, once a pencil with his initials carved faintly into the wood. Elise never asked about them, never moved them. She let them stay, as if they had their own quiet reasons for being there. One evening in January, she brought down a box from her closet. It smelled faintly of dust and old paper. She placed it on the coffee table and sat across from him. "These belonged to my father," she said. "He passed when I was 22. Most people don't know I still keep his things." Inside the box were sketchbooks larger than hers, mostly charcoal and ink. Simple drawings, factory workers, street vendors, musicians, a working man's view of beauty. "He drove trucks for 30 years, she said, "but he drew every night before bed," said the world made more sense on paper. Miles flipped carefully through the pages, silent. "He taught me how to see people," she added. Not just their outlines, but their pause, their worry, their joy. Your work feels like his, he said. Elise looked down at her hands. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of me now. Still renting, still working part-time, still figuring things out. He'd be proud, Miles said simply, because you never stopped seeing. They sat with that for a while. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavy and slow. Eventually, Elise turned toward him. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why aren't you married? He didn't laugh. He didn't stall. I spent too long building things I thought would protect me. Companies, properties, schedules. I told myself I didn't need anyone. That needing made you vulnerable. And now, Miles looked up. Now I think not needing anyone is lonelier than being wrong. She didn't reply. She only leaned back into the sofa, let her shoulder rest gently against his. It was the first time she'd initiated contact. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't performative. It was simply a kind of answer. That night, after he left, Elise stood at her window with the light off. She watched the snow gather softly on the railing, and for the first time in a long while her heart felt still. Not empty. Not waiting. Just still and quietly full. By February, Miles had stopped referring to Elise's apartment as your place. When he spoke of it, he used phrases like, when we're here, or let's leave that by the window. It wasn't deliberate. It was just how language shifted when comfort became familiarity. He brought over groceries one Friday, not fancy ones, just things she liked. Pears, sourdough, loose-leaf tea in a tin with no label. Elise raised an eyebrow as she unpacked. You remember all this? He shrugged. I pay attention. They spent the evening listening to an old record she'd found at a thrift store, scratched but warm. Neither of them said much. The kind of silence they shared now wasn't about avoiding it, was about belonging. After dinner, they ended up back at the window bench. A familiar routine. Outside, headlights passed like distant thoughts. Inside, Elise held a sketchbook across her knees. I've been working on something, she said, flipping through pages. Not a commission, just for myself. She turned the book toward him. It was a series of images scenes from the cafe, the library, the park where they'd walked that day in early winter. All small, all quiet. But each one held a trace of him. Not his face, not even his posture, but his presence. He studied them carefully. They don't look like me, he said. They're not supposed to. He looked up. They look like what you bring into a room, she added. Stillness, care, that sort of thing. Miles swallowed hard. He set the sketchbook down, then looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't rush to fill the silence. Then, slowly, would you come with me next week to meet my sister? She's real New England, straightforward, protective, but kind. Elise blinked, not out of fear but surprise. That's a big step. I know. She nodded, almost to herself. I think I'd like that. Later that night, while Miles washed the mugs in her small kitchen sink, Elise lit the candle on the windowsill, something she only did when the apartment felt particularly safe. She didn't say anything about it. And he didn't ask. But the flame glowed quietly between them, a kind of wordless understanding. The drive to New Hampshire was long, winding through stretches of highway flanked by pine and ash. It was late February, and the trees stood bare, their shadows long across patches of leftover snow. Miles drove with one hand resting gently on the gearshift. Elise watched the scenery slip by, not because it interested her particularly, but because stillness made her more nervous than motion. This okay? He asked at one point. She glanced at him. The road? He gave her a half smile. The invitation. She nodded slowly. Yes. I just haven't met anyone's family in a while. Years, really. I haven't brought anyone in a while, he admitted. So maybe we're both a little out of practice. They arrived at a modest house tucked into the woods, not luxurious, but warm in the way that matters. Curtains drawn back to let the light in. A coat rack by the door sagging slightly from years of use. The kind of place where arguments ended over coffee, and the floors still creaked in all the familiar spots. Ellen, Miles's older sister, greeted them at the door with a look that was equal parts scrutiny and welcome. She hugged her brother, then turned to Elise with a handshake that lingered not in coldness, but in curiosity. "You're the artist," Ellen said, more statement than question. "I suppose I am," Elise replied. They settled around a fire, the kind that popped and hissed at irregular intervals. Ellen poured wine. Miles, more quiet than usual, let the women lead. It didn't take long for Elise to understand their dynamic. Ellen was pragmatic, observant, with a loyalty that ran deep beneath her bluntness. "He's different with you," Ellen said after dinner, once the men had stepped outside to bring in more firewood. Elise hesitated. "Different how?" "Calmer. Like he's not trying to manage everything at once. I don't say that lightly." Elise folded her hands in her lap. "He listens," she said. "He doesn't always," Ellen replied, smiling faintly. "But maybe he's learning." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire move. Elise thought about all the things she could say, that she didn't know what this was yet, that she wasn't looking for rescue, that she still felt like she was standing at the edge of something unsure. Instead, she simply said, "I'm not in a hurry." Ellen nodded. "Good. He needs someone who knows how to stand still." On the drive home, the silence between Elise and Miles was different, not awkward, not tense, just thoughtful. At a red light, he reached for her hand. She let him take it, not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been quietly affirmed. It came on a Thursday. The forecast had warned of snow, but no one expected the wind to rise the way it did, rattling windows, forcing doors shut with sudden anger. The city slowed to a hush. By evening, the streets were empty. Sidewalks disappeared beneath blankets of white. Elise had canceled her library shift early. By dusk, she was home with candles lit, soup simmering low on the stove, and her radio humming with the soft static of a public jazz station. Miles texted once around 4. "Traffic's impossible. Might not get out of the city. Don't wait up." She stared at the message longer than she needed to, then placed the phone down without replying. She didn't feel disappointed, not exactly, just heavier. The kind of weight that comes from absence you hadn't planned on noticing. An hour passed, then 2. She ate alone, sketched briefly, let her pencil drop to the floor without picking it up. The wind howled against the glass like an unsettled question. At 9:17 a knock. She startled certain it was the building creaking, but then it came again, louder this time. She opened the door to find Miles. Jacket covered in snow, hair damp, cheeks flushed from wind and effort. "You walked here?" she asked, stunned. He nodded once, eventually took the train halfway. Streets were a mess. "You said—" "I know," he interrupted gently, "but I didn't want tonight to end with distance." She let him in. The apartment smelled of time and smoke. He removed his boots slowly, careful not to drip too much water on the rug. She handed him a towel. He didn't speak for a while. They sat on the floor near the radiator, sipping tea, knees almost touching. "I could have waited until morning," he said. "You could have. But I wanted to keep the promise, even if it was just to myself." Elise looked at him, really looked. The snow still clung to the edges of his coat. His hands were chapped from cold, his eyes tired, but open. Not a man chasing grand gestures. Just a man who showed up even when it was hard. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. She simply leaned her head to his shoulder, closed her eyes, and exhaled. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, they didn't speak again for a long time. They didn't need to. March arrived with a hesitance that matched Elise's mood-warmer air one day, bitter wind the next. The sidewalks were wet with thaw, and shopkeepers propped their doors open just enough to pretend spring had come early. But Elise didn't mind the slowness. She and Miles had fallen into a rhythm that neither of them tried to name. He came over with books she never asked for. She left sketches in his coat pockets, people in cafes, a sleeping dog on a train, sometimes him, but never clearly. There was no declaration, no plan, just presence. Until the morning her mother called. It was early, too early for anything casual. Elise answered half-dressed, coffee still steeping. "I had another episode last night," her mother said without letting. Elise froze. "I didn't want to worry you," the voice continued, measured but weak. "But I think it's time to talk about moving. I can't keep doing this alone." After the call, Elise stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the coffee go cold. She'd known this was coming. She just hadn't expected the choice to arrive so clearly. She'd need to move back to Vermont. Temporarily, maybe longer. And Miles? They hadn't said love. They hadn't even said us. But she felt him in the pauses of her day, the weight of his hand near hers, the way he watched her when she wasn't looking, the stillness he brought into every room he entered. When she told him about her mother, they were sitting on the steps outside the library, watching pedestrians dodge puddles. "She raised me on her own," Elise said. "No siblings, no help, just long shifts and cold dinners." "You want to go," Miles said, not as a question, but with understanding. "I think I need to." He nodded, slowly. "When?" "A few weeks, as soon as I can arrange things." Another silence, long but not strained. "Can I visit?" he asked finally. "You could." He looked at her, and his voice was quiet but sure. "I want to. If that's something you'd want too." "I don't know what it'll look like," she said. "It might be messy. I might disappear for a while. I'm not asking for perfect." She looked away. "I'm just asking for the part that's real," he added. Elise nodded, her eyes damp but steady. "You already have that part." They met one final time at Haven House before she left for Vermont. The table was waiting for them, number 9, back near the window, with its slightly uneven leg and the familiar scratches from years of coffee mugs and elbows and folded newspapers. It was evening, but not yet dark. The light outside was the color of ash, the in-between tone that arrives just before a city remembers it's time to turn the lights on. They didn't talk much at first. Elise stirred her tea slowly. Miles folded and unfolded a paper napkin without realizing it. When their eyes met, they didn't flinch. But they didn't smile, either. Not yet. "I packed most of my sketchbooks this morning," Elise said eventually. "Did you keep any out?" "Just one. Yours is in it." He raised an eyebrow. "Mine?" "Table 9, she said. "The first night. You, holding a spoon like you were trying to remember why it was there." Miles chuckled, low and warm. "I remember you were nervous." "I was," she said. "You weren't." "I was. I just hide things better." A pause. "I don't want this to end," he said plainly. "I don't either. But you need to go." She nodded. "I do." He accepted that, not because he wanted to, but because loving someone sometimes means not asking them to choose. From his coat pocket, he drew out a small envelope and slid it across the table. She looked at it, then at him. "Don't open it yet," he said. "Later, when the quiet gets heavy." Elise didn't ask what was inside. She didn't need to. When they stood to leave, they lingered beside the table. She touched the edge with her fingertips, a silent thank you to the place where things had begun by accident, but continued by choice. Outside, the city was colder than it had looked from the inside, but she didn't shiver. He walked her to the corner, as he always did, hands tucked in his coat, watching her without urgency. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "No," he agreed, "just a pause." They didn't kiss. That would have made it heavier than it was. Instead, he lifted a hand, touched the side of her face lightly, then let it fall. She walked away without turning back. He stayed at the corner until her figure disappeared into the blur of moving lights. The hills of Vermont were slow to thaw, but by late April, hints of green had begun to return, stubborn shoots pushing through the thawed earth like quiet promises. Elise spent her days helping her mother sort prescriptions, cook meals, and rearrange cabinets that didn't need rearranging. The work was tiring but good, honest in a way that filled her even as it drained her. At night, when the house was still, she sat by the window in the room she'd grown up in. The wallpaper faded, the desk scratched by a teenage version of herself, and opened her sketchbook. She drew Miles only once. Not his face. Just his coat, folded neatly on the back of a chair, a coffee cup beside it, a single line of steam. One evening, weeks after the snow had fully melted and the first dandelions were climbing through the lawn, she remembered the envelope he had given her at Haven House. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter brief, and written in the same deliberate hand he'd used on the first one. Elise, I hope the trees outside your window are beginning to remember their color. I hope the silence there is kind to you. There's no hurry, no countdown. I just wanted you to know I still sit at table 9 some afternoons. Not out of ritual, but because it reminds me what happens when we pause long enough to be seen. When you're ready for coffee, for company, for anything, I'll be there. M. Elise folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. Outside her window, a bird landed on the fence still for a moment, then gone. She didn't rush inside to pack, didn't call to say she was on her way. But she smiled, because sometimes love wasn't about declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes love was the simple trust that someone would stay, and that, when the time came, there would be a place waiting, small, familiar, and steady. Just like table 9.